technical subgroup. Welcome. Thank you for being here today. For those of you in the room, I will say you are very welcome to come sit at the table. Anyone is welcome to come sit at the table. We've got lots of space up here. This is an open group. Anyone is welcome to participate. We're going to kind of be diving into the weeds of the individual components of Safe Yield today, and we would love to have interaction and questions throughout. If you have any questions, please feel free to chime in throughout the meeting today. We do have a webinar running, so if you'd like to ask questions, it is easiest for you to sit at the table and speak into the microphones just so the participants on the webinar can hear you. And it is, since we do have a webinar running, it is helpful if you would just state your name before you start speaking so that those on the webinar can know what's going on. My name is Natalie Mast. I should have said my name before I started speaking. I'm sorry. My name is Natalie Mast. I am the program manager working on the management plans here at ADWR. I do have some additional ADWR staff here with me today. In the back running the webinar, as always, is McKenna Welsh. Thank you, McKenna, for doing a great job with that. Back there, we also have Maggie Martin. I do have a new management plans staff person who is joining us. Amanda Long-Rodriguez is here as well. To my left here is Enav Henningsen. She is the AMA director. And we also have some representatives from our hydrology group to help out today. Jeff Inwood is our chief hydrologist, and Diane Yunker is one of our modelers. So they'll be here to kind of help with some of the modeling questions that I am certainly not the expert on. Let's just run through the agenda really quick before we get started. I just want to point out, so we do post the agenda for these meetings online about a week ahead of time. We include those agendas in the reminder emails that we send out ahead of each meeting. We are making an effort to include a little bit more detail in those agendas just to provide a little extra time for you all to prepare for the meeting if you would like to. So please do, as meetings are coming up, please do watch out for those agendas. In this particular meeting, like I said, we are going to be working through some of the individual components of the annual Safe Yield calculation. We might not get through all of them today, but that would be okay. We can always kind of overlap this into a second meeting as needed. Kind of the idea here is that we will be able to work through some of the questions and issues that we have related to those individual components throughout this meeting. So just for background for any of you who may not have attended meetings previously, this is a meeting focusing on the 5th management plans. We do have 2 concurrent processes going on. I know there are a lot of meetings. So we are currently working to complete the remaining 3 4th management plans. Phoenix, Pinal, and Santa Cruz have not yet adopted their 4th management plans. We do have a hearing this upcoming Monday for the Phoenix 4th management plan. So for those of you who are in the Phoenix AMA, that will be an interesting meeting. And then we are hoping to complete the adoption of all 3 of those plans by the end of this year. The management plans work group is this process. So as a part of that management plans work group, we're assessing the existing conservation programs and working to develop new conservation programs for the 5th management plans. This particular group is looking specifically into safe yield and kind of all the things that go with that. It's a complex topic. Safe yield, like I said, is kind of a complex topic. So the goals that we have for this group are, like we're doing today, assessing each component, having a conversation about each of those components so we can gain an understanding, gain some consensus around each component and the consensus around that annual calculation of safe yield. so that we can kind of move on to talking about how we do the long-term analysis, and also to talking about how we might communicate safe yield in kind of a clear and concise way more broadly outside of this group. That's something that we've kind of struggled with in the past, is that communication of safe yield and the status of each AMA with regards to its goal. So that aside, we'll dive right in. Does anybody have any questions before I dive right into the components? Any comments before we get started? No? All right, we'll go ahead and jump in then. So, just as a little bit of background, again, safe yield is defined in statute. A groundwater management goal which attempts to achieve and thereafter maintain a long-term balance between the annual amount of groundwater withdrawn in an active management area and the annual amount of natural and artificial recharge in the active management area. So what we're looking at here is groundwater focus. You'll see in the components that this is groundwater focus. This is not including the water that is stored underground that is legally classified as things other than groundwater. So effluent or Colorado River water may be stored underground. We're not including that water here. So we'll kind of come back to that a little bit over and over again as we work through this issue, but that's just something to keep in mind, that this is a groundwater focused metric. So these components that you can see on the screen here, I believe they were also listed on the back of the agenda, in case you can't see this very well. These are what we're going to be working through today, and maybe we'll run out of time today. We'll see if we need to spill this over into a second meeting. But these are the individual components that we're going to be working through. The way I have them highlighted here is the blue ones are ones that are outputs of our regional groundwater models, which is why I have representatives from our hydrology group here today. And the gray ones are items that are compiled from our AMA annual reports. As we get into kind of the conversation about these individual components, we'll talk about a little bit of the differences there, and there might be some opportunity to make things more consistent, to kind of streamline things in our data sources here. The AMA data that I refer to, you'll notice that that most of my data isn't updated to a year more recent than 2017. There is a reason for that. It's not because our data is very far behind. It's because it takes a long time to compile that data and get that data incorporated into the models. So each year, annual reports are due on March 31st. That data that comes in through those annual reports in the AMAs goes through a quality control process, gets entered into our databases, gets compiled to the sector and AMA level, and then once that kind of AMA compilation happens, so all of that AMA compilation takes through about November each year. Once that AMA compilation happens, then we can hand off that data to our hydrology group, who can then incorporate it into the models. So our AMA data lags by about a year, and then the hydrology data lags kind of even further behind that, just by nature of making sure that that data is reasonably final and working it into these compiled forms. So with that background aside, let's talk about some groundwater inflows. We're going to start with kind of an easy one here. The first one on that list is groundwater inflows. There's not a lot of complexity necessarily associated with this one, so maybe it's a good one to start with. If you look at that list on the back of your agendas, you have two sides of that calculation, inflows and outflows. So if you think about that kind of being the pluses and minuses of this calculation, we're going to focus on the inflows first. The first item on that list is groundwater inflow. This particular item This particular item is a component of natural recharge, and this is something that we get kind of as a straightforward output of our regional groundwater models. I say this is maybe a pretty simple one because there's not necessarily a lot to say here. This is, to my understanding, this is treated pretty similarly across the different AMAs. This is usually pretty steady over time. There's not a complexity here, and it seems to be something that fits well within the calculation of safe field. Are there any questions about this particular item or how we're going to kind of treat these individual components before I move on? Terry Sue?
So is this one of the numbers you get from the modelers?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
that's correct.
And is this, it's been a long time since I've worked on these models, so is this basically what flows in from a different basin into that basin, the one you're modeling, or this AMA, I guess? Is that, maybe have the modelers explain it to us.
Sure.
I believe this would represent underflow at the boundary conditions. So the water flowing from one basin to the other through a boundary.
Yes, and I'll just add that not all boundaries are coming into a basin. Obviously, there are times where it's going out of a basin, so we're not talking about the outflow side of it yet, but it can be either way. The components where the model shows it coming in would be the inflow, and we term that underflow.
And so then that number, then, is that reliant upon let's say the upstream basin of having a groundwater model there that tells you what that number is? Where does that number come from?
Most of the models are done independently of each other, and they have a combination of boundary conditions, either constant head, specified flux, or some other type. And from the model output, you can sometimes, or you can always calculate the flux at the boundaries. So where models overlap, you can use something called zone budget to get the flux at a boundary between one AMA and another. But the calculations are done on that specific model. They're not usually cross. We don't attempt to overlap all the models and have the fluxes going from one model to another model. Although we do look at that qualitatively, but it's by the individual developed model.
So you have to forgive me. I'm not an expert in this type of thing. But it's a number, right? Is it a number? Okay.
Yes, it's a calculated number.
Okay.
But it's calculated in different ways depending on the boundary condition, the way it's set up in the model. So each model can have different calculations for the boundary condition.
Okay.
We don't want to get into the weeds of determining how the boundary conditions are set for every model and at every boundary for every model, but in general, that's how it works.
Okay.
Yeah, Krista.
Krista McJunkin, SRP. Is the inflow, or I guess the outflow, also at the boundary, mostly driven just by like the kind of background hydrologic structure, or is the pumping in the area change? Like, does that change over time? Would you see that if pumping increases or decreases in the vicinity of the boundary, that it would change the inflow or outflow?
Yeah, you're asking detailed modeling questions about the type of boundary condition that's set up, but it does matter. But there are the way where you have water levels between one basin and the next, and that will drive the flow from high to low. So, but that's not always the same boundary condition approach.
So it sounds like it's customized to the boundary condition in that specific area, but that you are we would expect to see this number be different every year based on the pumping in that year. Would that be fair?
Okay. Good. All right. So part of what we want to do as part of this conversation is, yes, understand these individual components. Some of these components, kind of like groundwater inflow, are pretty straightforward. This is a component of a groundwater budget. My assumption here is that we'll go ahead and go forward with continuing to include this as a part of the calculation. So the next item we have on the list is stream bed recharge. So this is also a natural component of recharge and counted as an inflow in that calculation. And this is also an output of ADWR's regional groundwater models. This particular item is variable from year to year, depending on data that our hydrology group gets from stream gauges and that sort of thing. The particular method of calculation might vary depending on the exact model, depending on the AMA, but for the most part, this is based on actual stream gauge data and is calculated again as a part of the models, perhaps. I don't know if you want a further explanation of that from the modelers, or are there any questions on that particular item?
So one question that I have is the kind of thought behind including the lagging. So maybe if you could speak to the kind of theory behind why it would be shown lagging for the purposes of a safe yield calculation.
So my understanding of lagging in the models, at least, and please, Jeff or Diane, correct me if I totally butcher this, is that it's more of a calculation of when that water is deemed to have reached the aquifer to be available for pumping. For something like safe yield, sometimes we lag things, sometimes we don't. It's kind of more of a function of data availability than anything. Whether we would want to continue lagging something like stream bed recharge, where I think the exact calculation of how those things are lagged is potentially different across models. Whether we would want to continue doing that might be a question of whether we would be able to get that data if it was not lagged. I don't believe that sort of data would be available outside of our models. So
I'll just throw out there, and we don't have to dwell on this because I think it probably goes more towards maybe changes in how safe yield is calculated as opposed to understanding the components. Mm-hmm. But I think there's some there might be some logic behind differentiating between how you reasonably, and of course you would need to include the time lag in the groundwater model itself, because you're trying to predict and show actual water levels, as opposed to a safe yield calculation that's more of a checkbook plus and minus snapshot of that year, and not necessarily trying to capture actual water levels. It's really just a plus and minus balancing exercise. So if there were a way to produce a good stream bed recharge number without time lagging it, I think it's something we should consider.
Okay. So
all the models include 7 or 8 different kinds of recharge. Ag is usually a large one that is usually lagged as part of the calibration process. Sometimes the depth of water is quite significant in those areas. Typically with the stream recharge, we haven't usually applied a lag just because theoretically the depth to water under the stream is very shallow. And then there's several other urban and artificial and lake and other types of recharge, and it's handled differently depending on the model for regional differences. And it's all documented pretty well in our reports, why we do it differently in different AMAs. But and then, the question of lag is always something that we're trying to improve the timing of that, because it's a complicated hydrologic thing. So.
Natalie. David Snyder, Pinal AMA GOAC. Several times there's been statements indicating that inflow and stream bed recharge is dependent on how long it takes to hit the aquifer. Secondly, then there was a statement about depth to aquifer is pretty shallow, and a stream bed is, I guess I'm looking for a rough statement about the amount of time. Is it years for that stream bed recharge to get to the aquifer? And I understand it's a variable depending on the depth to the aquifer, but roughly speaking, is it just a couple of years as opposed to 40 years, months, what?
What I will say to that is, in our modeling for more prevalent significant recharge like agricultural, it can be up to 20 years. So but it is variable.
One more question about stream bed recharge. What data sources are you using to update the model to reflect that current year's stream flow in order to, produce the current stream bed recharge?
So it's USGS gauge data. Where we don't have that, we will have to estimate flows, and can be done in a couple different ways, but one of the primary components is the size of the contributing watershed and frequency of flood events, things of that nature.
Is this an area where additional instrumentation or data would make a difference in the accuracy of the inputs and ultimately what the model tells us?
Yeah, I would say yes.
I mean, I know we always want more data, but I mean, if there were specific, locations or areas that could benefit, I think that's something we should kind of park as something to talk about.
Yeah, areas where we don't have measured data it would be helpful to have it. Along water courses where we have gauges, do we need more? Maybe, but probably the biggest need would be in areas where there aren't any gauges.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So we'll, again, this particular item, output from our groundwater models, is a reasonably intuitive component of a groundwater budget. So this one, I am, without seeing any objections, I'm assuming that this one will remain as a part of the calculation. All right, so we'll move on. So this next one, again, is a fairly straightforward one. I promise we'll get into some more complicated conversations here a little with one of the next ones. Mountain front recharge is an inflow, is a natural component, and again is an output of our regional groundwater models. This item is typically just held constant from year to year. There may be some changes for various reasons, but typically this is just a component, one output used to help balance the groundwater models. Any further explanation there, or any questions?
Well, I'll just add that this is an estimated value that is typically done through a steady state analysis before any development, human activity, well pumping. So it comes in with a basic number. We don't calculate it, or we don't have direct measurements of recharge or even runoff down the mountain front. And then it can be used in the calibration process of the model and adjusted for calibration or through calibration.
Thanks, Jeff. Any questions there?
Sorry.
Okay.
So I understand how this isn't something you would typically gauge, but it seems like it would be dependent on precipitation. That that if a year with a lot of rainfall, you'd see more. And I mean, is it just not enough of a difference to bother calculating? So it's better just to use the same number every year?
I would say that it would require you'd have to do all kinds of data collection on every mountain front and then run surface water models on top of infiltration studies that would just be impractical. And but in reality, yes, if there's more precipitation, there's generally more flow. But that's where we can try to adjust that component along with other components in the calibration process. Typically, the mountain front recharge is fairly insignificant overall, but it varies between models. There's some models where it is more prevalent than others.
I'll just say too, like Jeff was saying, it's a small number compared to other types of recharge. In wet years where there's more precipitation, that's more reflected in the stream gauge recharge. So.
Thank you. Okay. All right. Now we'll go ahead and move on to one that might be a little bit more complicated. So our first item here that is not natural recharge. So this is a component of artificial recharge, still an inflow. We're still working through our inflow list. What we're looking at here is incidental recharge. So we have, if you look at that list on your agendas, we do have different kind of components of incidental recharge. So agricultural, municipal, industrial. The kind of complexity here is that municipal and industrial incidental recharge are calculated as just a percent of total demand from those sectors. So that information comes from our AMA annual reports. We take the total demand. M&I each get assigned a percentage, which is calculated into their incidental recharge for that year. So that kind of water gets applied or counted in the year that the demand occurs. So it's not lagged in any way. We've kind of been talking about that lagging thing. Agricultural incidental recharge is different. That line item comes from our groundwater models, is still based partially at least on those annual reports on those total demands that are applied to the ground, but it also gets combined with estimates regarding Indian water use, Indian agriculture. So that agricultural one combines the AMA ag and Indian ag, and also may be lagged in different ways depending on the AMA. So,
speaking to the agricultural component, we typically try to incorporate the irrigation methods and efficiencies to inform us about the percentage of water applied to the field that will ultimately be incidental agricultural recharge. And there again, this component can be rather significant. Just as an example, in our most recent canal model, we estimated that at 34% for the non-Indian districts based on a heavily flood irrigation methodology in the area. And it can also be another component that is adjusted through calibration. Again, it's an estimate. It has to be, there's no way to measure exactly how much water goes through the root zone into the subsurface for deep percolation. And then in our modeling, we can treat the lagging component part of it differently, but the amount that is actually deemed to be incidental agricultural recharge going past the root zone is the number that we provide for the safe yield number.
I have a question, Natalie. Gretchen Baumgartner, Town and Gilbert. So this, I think, this question pertains to safe yield, but it also pertains to the next designation process. And so, as a municipality, from what I understand, is every municipality has a multiplier based on its community characteristics, and each community is slightly different. Will the department look to kind of true up what those multipliers are based on what 2025 looks like in comparison to what 2010 looked like?
Sure. So I was not around when that original multiplier was created for incidental recharge for the municipal sector, for example. What I imagine we will do as cities are being redesignated and that sort of thing is check in with our assured water supply group and make sure that those incidental recharge factors are kind of matching up so that we're being consistent across the department with that. Yeah.
Melody Lawyer, FICO Farmers Water. Golf course irrigation, is there any incidental recharge associated with golf courses?
Sure. So golf courses are included in our industrial sector. So there is a calculation associated with the industrial sector for incidental recharge as well. And that, again, kind of the percentage of that kind of takes into account the different types of uses and the proportions there. Any other questions, suggestions, thoughts on this particular category?
I have a question about the Indian agricultural water use. Have you approached any of the tribes in having them provide this information for the purposes of, not because they're obligated to report, but just for the purposes of improving these calculations?
From the agricultural component, we've asked for information and data. Don't have anything to report on that right now.
Yeah, and largely our estimates around that are based largely on the agricultural acreage, that type of thing. So we do create calculated estimates around those numbers each year, but I don't know specifically about any conversations about getting additional data there.
And everything in the past has been based on estimates that we've developed.
Natalie? David Snyder again. So, I understand the variability and don't want to get too far into the weeds. I'm interested in what generally is perceived as call it the default percentage of incidental recharge for municipality, and I understand it's variable, but industrial as well. Golf courses, no golf courses, lots of turf, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What's the default percentage for those two?
Is it okay? I wasn't remembering the exact number off the top of my head. I think Krista, you're right that it's 4 or 5%, something like that. 4% for municipal. I think the industrial number is. Yeah,
okay.
I think industrial is a little bit higher.
5, 10, 15.
I'm not remembering the specific number. I would hate to quote you the wrong number, but I think industrial is a little bit higher for the incidental recharge calculation.
I'm putting it a little bit higher. Thank you.
So, but those are historically something that were kind of considered the characteristics of the AMA, considered the types of uses. Golf courses, for example, are going to have a higher rate of incidental recharge than other types of industrial uses. So that is something that was kind of taken into consideration in the development of those incidental recharge percentages. So maybe a question to ask the group here today is, since these are kind of calculated in different ways, this is kind of our opportunity to reconsider this framework. So we do get the agricultural incidental recharge from the models that is based, as Jeff said, on the prevalent type of irrigation and that sort of thing within the AMA. However, we would be able to consider as a part of this group treating the agricultural incidental recharge more similarly to the way we treat the municipal and industrial incidental recharge. If that is something we would like to consider. We could continue getting it from the groundwater models, or we could match our percentage to the percentage that the modelers use and apply that kind of on an annual basis rather than getting that information directly from the models. Are there any questions or thoughts around a strategy one way or another that we might take, Krista?
I would just go back to my thought before about that time lagging is certainly an appropriate approach for the groundwater model, but I think it's better to take a more kind of checkbook balance approach for the safe yield calculation, and which might actually make the annual update easier than having to update the entire model for something that I think could be based on a more simplified calculation. I'm wondering, I don't actually know how, like when you make estimates of how much is, what type of irrigation style there, or how the water is applied, is that something that the IGFRs have to report to you, or is that something you're just estimating based on some other basis? Or whoever knows.
So that is not information that we currently have in our ADWR databases. There are other data sources out there. USGS, for example, occasionally do field verifications of that sort, and we tend to use that type of data for the irrigation type information. I don't know if that directly answers your question, but
I'm just thinking of if there's, again, this kind of like parking lot idea. If there's new data that we need, I don't know how onerous it would be. I don't want to propose that, for other folks besides myself that have to report. But if it is something that would be, a simple thing to report about, what kind of irrigation system they're using, if it would simplify this calculation or improve it, that's at least something worth talking about with the folks in that sector.
I'm going to go ahead and mirror and agree with that, I guess. And I absolutely respect the model and what it is as a useful tool, but it kind of sounds like there's a decent amount of factors that are estimated or gotten from the model, and you can always do more with more data. And I know right now everyone's asking the department for more data. So what would be nice is to understand a tabular form of what would be better data for the model to have to make these representations more accurate. The idea of getting recharge from ag as a part of the model is just eyebrow raising, and maybe it's not representing some sectors of ag appropriately. So it would be interesting to see the department explore what could be a better solution or calculation based on the resources that you have.
Oh, and I should say that anything we kind of talk about in the context of calculating incidental recharge for ag in the context of safe yield or overdraft might be different than the way they treat it in the model. Those are kind of separate functions. We might treat it in a simplistic water budget manner, to kind of Krista's point, for the purposes of safe yield, because it makes sense for this type of calculation, but that type of approach might not necessarily make sense for the models. Jeff?
Yeah, for those who aren't really familiar with groundwater modeling, numerical groundwater modeling, first, our models are regional. So they are not designed to be concerned about what happens down to the IGFR level. We do a grid of a model overlay. Those grids are usually a half mile by a half mile or a mile by a mile. So trying to ascertain the irrigation type IGFR by IGFR is not going to be something that will be useful from the modeling standpoint. Again, if you want to make a more simplified approach for the safe yield calculation, then maybe you could do that. But from our standpoint in modeling, we're looking regionally. So it's about numbers over a wide area. So we are not, and I know it sounds kind of counterintuitive, with this spot versus that spot is not our focus. We're looking big picture.
This is David again, Snyder from Canal AMA. I concur that there needs to be additional input, particularly from the ag sector. Natalie, I'm appreciative of the fact that the numbers used for safe yield are different than the other numbers, but decisions are going to be made on the basis of safe yield, and I think it's advisable to get some significant input from the ag sector when it comes to incidental recharge and the larger picture.
It's just a question about incidental recharge. It's from the numbers that you're giving there, and assuming that incidental recharge for a municipality is a percentage of demand, it implies, and maybe I've got this wrong, that a typical homeowner, a typical user, a certain amount of that water is going to go back into the ground, so that's why I use that percentage. Many of the municipalities are also very aggressive with stormwater management, and on the other side of that is they're very aggressive with vector management, and that water's got to go back into the ground very quickly to stop vectors from happening. How is that amount of water that's actively being recharged through the retention basins and the stormwater management program being factored into this?
Yeah, from the modeling standpoint, those specific components we're looking in general. The stream, mountain front recharge, we're not breaking down by specific detention basins over a regional area.
And I was even thinking regionally too, because I know many of the municipalities in this area have adopted a standard of the 100-year 2-hour storm must be retained on site and disposed of within 36 hours to stop vector problems. And so that's a substantial amount of water with all of the impervious cover that we have here that is then bringing all that water to retention basins. So it almost seems like another element of incidental recharge that would mirror something like mountain front recharge or stream front recharge, now that we're actively doing this in the municipalities.
So sorry, that's Gretchen Baumgartner, Town and Gilbert. That was one of the original reasons why I asked my question about incidental recharges. As every single municipality, the percentage is different. So for the Town of Gilbert, it's relatively well compared to some of the other cities. But that percentage, I guess I would hope that in 2025, regardless of the model for safe yield, it will be looked at as part of what the actual percentage is compared to the demand.
Oh, sorry.
So I asked the modelers to describe how they came up with different recharge components. And yeah, urban is just based on a small percent. I'm seeing like 4% of the total reported use, and so it's just spread out. If that number needs to be adjusted because urban area has grown or their practices are different, I think, then we could think about adjusting it, but that's just, it's definitely very much generalized for the modeling purposes.
This is Melody Lawyer again with FICO Farmers Water. I do think that agriculture should get a little bit more, focused. Part of the Green Valley Pecan Farm is transitioning to a spray irrigation, which we expect will reduce groundwater recharge, and enhance and reduce our overall water usage and pumping. So there should be some consideration, maybe more focus on where agricultural irrigation is going, because we're all making changes to enhance our water use.
Sure, and as we do hear about those types of changes in irrigation types, my understanding is that those percentages associated with incidental recharge can be adjusted over time. Okay, so what I'm kind of hearing here, and maybe nod or shake your head at me, is it may make sense for, in the context of calculating safe yield and overdraft, to go with a more simplistic approach with regard to agricultural recharge, kind of matching that to the methodology we use for municipal and industrial recharge. Would that kind of be the preference in the room? Is that what I'm understanding?
Not without additional input.
Okay.
So if you're, from my perspective, if you're expecting a blanket okie dokie, I can't do that until such time as we have additional input.
And what can you help clarify a little bit? Are we looking for input related to what that percentage is, to how it's treated, to can you help me understand a little bit more to all of those things? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, we will go ahead and move on. It sounds like we may have to come back to this item at a future meeting, too. So canal seepage is an inflow component. This is kind of counted in the artificial section, and this, again, is an output of ADWR's regional groundwater models. My understanding is that this number is based on kind of canal mileage and whether those canals are lined or unlined. So there is some variation between AMAs on exactly how this canal seepage volume is calculated. Are there any questions with relation to this particular component? Any thoughts here?
All right. I have a Krista McJunkin from SRP. Is this time lagged, or is it shown by year?
Well, the numbers we report out of the model are just the numbers that go into the ground.
One more question. Is it, how are the canal miles and miles of lined or unlined, how are they updated? Is it just, or how frequently are they updated? Do you need, is that a survey that's done routinely, or?
We've I don't know if there is a regular update of that. We have the canal systems that are included in the model, and but we're not going out and surveying and coming up with revised numbers on a regular basis.
We are making a change to annual reports, requesting that the percentage of lined or unlined canals within districts be reported to us as part of those annual reports. So that will be a place where we will be getting some additional data in the future.
And Krista, that response was as it relates to the model. So.
I can't speak too much about other AMAs, but in canal, the canal recharge is a function of what we get reported from the SCIP report. It's a percentage of the reported canal loss. So they have sort of a system, and they have a flow at one area and then one at the end, and then there's a loss calculated, and then a percent of that is considered canal seepage, and then it's just spatially distributed along the canal system. And historically, those have been also unlined. I know that there was some effort to line them, but we don't have information on how that's going. So that sort of information would be helpful, and hopefully, if they're lined, the loss number, so the difference between one end and the other will be smaller, and so it'll be reflected that way also and caught that way. But that would definitely be an area where we could use more information, I think. So.
This is David from Pinell AMA. I'd suggest that the same effort to secure additional information be made with regard to the Gila River Indian community, which, as you know, has been undergoing a substantial canal lining process with the Bureau and the Corps of Engineers over the past 10, 15 years now. And it's a substantial effort, and a lot of canal miles are being lined.
Any other questions, comments on that item? Okay, seeing none, we'll go ahead and move on. This next item here is cut to the aquifer. So this is kind of one of those that overlaps our paper water and wet water. So cut to the aquifer is when artificial recharge occurs, when Colorado River water, for example, is stored in a storage facility. There is a portion of that, a percentage of that gets counted as a cut to the aquifer. So this particular item is calculated based on reports to our AMA and recharge groups. The exact percent can vary by the type of water, by the type of facility, and that sort of thing. But this, again, is a pretty straightforward piece. It's a piece of that stored water that then becomes groundwater. Excuse me. Are there any questions? Sorry. One last thing, this item is not lagged. This piece is counted in the year that water is stored. Are there any questions or comments related to cut to the aquifer?
Several. Wally Wilson with Metro Water District down in the Tucson AMA. I'm not sure where to fit this, but this seems, I don't want the meeting to get away. So without the artificial recharge, there wouldn't be any cut to any aquifer. And yet that which is stored beyond that cut to the aquifer is not considered in calculations. it's represented in the model, correct? When 144,000 acre-feet of water is artificially recharged, that goes into the model's aquifer. But in the calculation for safe yield, that volume is ignored. So there actually is an increase in the actual, thinking like an aquifer, there is a demonstrable increase in the storage volume of water that's within the model. And you can see that with water levels that continue to rise instead of fall, even when pumping is occurring. So is that something that should be considered in the future look at safe yield calculations? I'm not suggesting a particular methodology, but Tucson AMA does nothing but recharge. So the water all goes in the ground, and then the water all comes out of the ground. That water is coming out of the ground more frequently close to or at the actual point of recharge. So some of those molecules are actually being recovered in that year. So it's just kind of a quandary that in safe yield calculations, actual aquifer storage volumes are not considered, or changes in them, plus or minus, because in different parts of the AMA, they go differently. But the calculation is AMA-wide, so I simplify the AMA calculation as a bucket in the spreadsheet, because it doesn't matter where the water goes in the bucket. It just matters that it go in, and it just matters if some comes out the bottom. So thus the input and output flows like an aquifer. But it's bothersome to me that the component of long-term stored water is not accounted for.
Sure.
So let's go to a point where suddenly there's no imported water coming into the bucket. But there's that aquifer storage volume that is now going to be used. Is that now doubly debited against the AMA as, oh, it's all groundwater being pulled out?
So
that time difference over a long period is a question that many have in the SAWA community.
So if I can clarify a little bit, the way we treat safe yield is not perfectly hydrologic. It's not perfectly linked to water levels because there is that water stored underground, which is not classified as groundwater. So when, if you imagine storing some CAP water in Tucson, the water levels rise, that CAP water is then recovered. It's classified still as Colorado River water when it's recovered, and those water levels may fall again associated with that recovery. So that kind of chunk of water, if you will, remains classified as Colorado River both in the recharge process and in the recovery process. So at no point does that water get considered as a part of safe yield because it's not groundwater, because this calculation is a groundwater focused thing. So what may get considered is the portion that is the cut to the aquifer, which becomes groundwater, which is intended to remain in the aquifer or become groundwater. So it's not a perfectly hydrologic thing. It's not a perfectly, it's not perfectly related to water levels in that way, because we're trying to focus on the portion of water underground that is legally classified as groundwater. And what we want to ensure is that there is a balance between groundwater going in and groundwater going out, where those other, we use these underground aquifers as kind of a storage repository, so those other portions of water that are underground are just a separate calculation there, if that makes sense. I don't know if I'm being totally clear on the rationale there.
So again, I'm thinking about, there's today, but there's 50 years from now when perhaps the annual storage and recovery is insufficient to meet demand. So there's not enough CAP to meet demand for a particular provider, so they prefer to pump their long-term storage credits. So is that still, that pumpage is going to be zero in the calculation?
Right. So that pumping gets counted as Colorado River water at that point because the water retains its legal characteristics both through storage and recovery.
Okay.
That's correct.
I think, Wally, you bring up a good point, though, with regard to how we talk about this. We have to be careful that we distinguish between the kind of view of the world in the safe yield calculation, which is just, kind of a checkbook plus and minus, and what's actually happening under the ground. So you could be in safe yield and have water levels that drop because you're recovering water you stored a long time ago that's not groundwater. And how we talk about that to our customers, our residents, our leaders is a difficult thing. It's not an easy message to share, but it's a true fact. And it's something I think we all need to be thinking about as we approach, 2025.
I agree. Another item was brought to my attention just now. Cut to aquifer on groundwater storage facility. So water physically is not going in the aquifer, and yet some of that water becomes a cut to an aquifer as long as its CAP is or effluent is offsetting the groundwater pumping, and it's not some local source, it's an imported source per se. Where does that 5% in the aquifer actually come from, and how's it modeled differently? I mean, that sounds like it's a pure calculation on a spreadsheet.
So that really is kind of a...
That's what I thought. It's magic water. There we go.
I might not have said it that way.
Conservation of math.
So it really, in terms of the GSFs, it really is a paper water type of calculation. So water gets applied to the field, and a portion of the groundwater, or what was groundwater, becomes classified as Colorado River water or effluent or whatever it was that was stored. So in the same way as what we were talking about before, when that chunk of water gets recovered, it's still classified as effluent or Colorado River water or whatever the water that was stored or saved in this instance.
Many of my questions are being couched by members of SAWA that don't totally understand it. So I may understand it, but I'm asking these questions such that there's a collective answer that I can bring back to the group and say, this is how it's thought of. So, but I also think more like the aquifer, more like the model.
So, and that's and that's maybe a point of clarification, is that this calculation, this overdraft calculation, because it is solely it's this hybrid of hydrologic factors and legal factors where it's not purely a physical thing. So it's not perfectly going to be reflected in the model, which is why we kind of have this mishmash of reported numbers and hydrology numbers. So it's kind of a confusing thing to be able to talk about where it's not purely physical. It's not going to purely be reflected in the groundwater levels. We're focusing just on that legally classified groundwater for this particular calculation.
I will say that the Tucson AMA has the good fortune of hovering around safe yield for the past 10 years. But for CAP importation, there would be no such thing. So
I just wanted to pick up on what Krista said and Natalie just touched on. As the safe yield is not the same as just aquifer health, our groundwater modeling is not designed from a safe yield standpoint. So we do our modeling and based on other approaches and factors and the modeling packages that are developed. So it's trying to customize modeling results to fit into the safe yield components doesn't always work. So just want to point that out, that we have our modeling tools and we can produce several things out of them, but they're just how we build our models. That's what drives us.
Thanks, Jeff. Okay. Any other questions about cut to the aquifer? Any questions, comments here? Good. All right. The last item on the inflow side of our list, I'm just checking the time here. The last item on the inflow side of our list is CGRD replenishment. So this is an artificial component, an inflow component. This is replenishment of groundwater pumping that has already occurred. So if a municipal provider pumps groundwater in excess of their groundwater allowance, then they incur a replenishment obligation. In the case of how we've treated this historically for the purposes of safe yield, that replenishment is counted in the year that replenishment obligation is incurred. So right now, the way we treat this is we kind of this is a little bit backwards from the lagging. It's a pre-addition there, where the replenishment is going to occur sometime in those next 3 years, but we just kind of, for simplicity's sake, counted in the year that the obligation is incurred. Are there any questions with regard to GRD replenishment and how that's treated for the purposes of safe yield? Anybody? Okay, no questions? That's an easy one? All right.
I'm sorry, I have a question, not so much about that, but how is annual storage and recovery different than this?
So annual storage and recovery is going to be other types of water. So that's going to be Colorado River water that is stored and recovered in the same year. So that doesn't get classified as groundwater. That doesn't get included as a part of the calculation of safe yield.
But isn't the GRD storing?
Right. So GRD is replenishing groundwater for the purposes of replacing that groundwater which has already been pumped. So rather than getting long-term storage credits for that recharge that they're doing, they're not necessarily storing water, they're replenishing water. So they are recharging water. That water that they recharge does then get classified as groundwater because they're not getting long-term storage credits for it. They are replacing groundwater that has already been pumped.
And so explain to me how annual storage and recovery would be really any different than that?
Because annual storage and recovery is not water that has already been pumped necessarily. It is water that is stored and recovered in the same year and that water is going to maybe be associated with a municipal provider. That provider stores that water and then recovers that Colorado River water, for example, in the same year. It's kind of a different function where if a city is a CGRD member, they might not necessarily have access to that Colorado River water to store and then recover, so the GRD may replace the groundwater they pump on their behalf. Hopefully I didn't botch that too badly.
This is Melody Lawyer again, FICO Farmers Water. Doesn't the CAGRD have reserves, which are basically long-term storage credits, and perhaps those reserves might be treated the same as Colorado River water?
Sure. So in that case, if they're using those reserves to fulfill a replenishment obligation, they don't actually pump that water. They're not actually recovering that water. What they're doing is kind of retiring those long-term storage credits. Those long-term storage credits that may be classified as Colorado River water when they're long-term storage credits, those get retired or canceled in some way, and that chunk of water becomes groundwater, legally classified as groundwater.
This is Terry Sue again. So maybe the answer to my question is that the groundwater that was pumped, or the water that was pumped, is considered surface water, so it's not a part of the equation. Right? So if you don't count what was stored, you also don't count what was recovered. Is that true?
I'm not sure if I'm following that question.
Well, if I store and recover CAP water in the same year,
right,
right? So
then it only is ever classified as Colorado River water. That does not apply to the calculation of safe yield.
Yeah, so even on the pumping side, it would be considered Colorado
right.
River water.
When you recover that, it is still classified as Colorado River water. That's correct. Yeah. Any other questions here? Okay. We are about 15 minutes before our end time here. We've gotten through all of our inflows, so that's good progress. So perhaps I'll just hold on to the outflows rather than starting the outflow section now. We can hold on to that for our next meeting, and we can work through those next time. Some of the outflows at least are a little bit more straightforward, so perhaps that won't take as long to work through once we get to that meeting. I would like to say all of the data that we're talking about here today is currently available on our website in our data templates. It's posted on our AMA data page. I am the first to admit that the format of that data does not necessarily make it super easy to use. We are working on improving that. We hope to publish a data set associated with safe yield online sometime within the next couple weeks. I don't have an exact timeline for that, but we will be posting a data set regarding safe yield online on that same AMA data page. We are also working on developing a dashboard similar to the supply and demand dashboard that is already on that AMA data page with regard to safe yield, so that it is a little bit easier to see and play around with some of that data. So we are working on doing a better job of sharing that data, of publishing that compiled data and making it available in a way that is easy to see and understand and look at the particularities of your sector or your AMA. So that's in progress. I don't have good set timelines for that, but it's coming. So please do check out that AMA data page. That is something that we are really proud of. It's fairly simple even now, but that's been a big improvement for us in terms of sharing some of our compiled data and getting some of our water use data out into the world. If you do check out that page, please do feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or comments or thoughts about how that data sharing might be improved. That is something we are trying to work on as an agency, is to improve both our data quality but also the transparency and availability of that data. So with that, we do have a number of additional meetings coming up. I mentioned Monday afternoon at 1 p.m. in this room is the hearing for the Phoenix AMA Fourth Management Plan. We also have a number of work group meetings coming up. I think the last meeting we had, the next municipal meeting, was not yet on the calendar. We're going to send a reminder email out about that one, but that next municipal subgroup is on March 9th. We have an ag subgroup meeting on March 3rd, and we have a meeting of the full work group, where we'll kind of check in and provide updates from all of these subgroups on March 19th. So we do appreciate all of the stakeholder input and engagement that we've had throughout this process. We've gotten a lot of really good feedback and ideas and interaction throughout this process. That's been really, really helpful. That's been something that's going to really be critical to the success of this process as we work to finalize some of these concepts and work toward the development of the fifth management plan. So thank you for that. Thank you for your time. David, do you look like you have a question? Excuse me. We do not yet have that on the calendar. I will check in with my staff and determine whether we'll have a chance to get that in before the next full work group meeting, or whether that'll need to be after. So I don't have an answer for that yet, but we will be sending out an email to our email list with that next date. If any of you are not currently on that mailing list for those meetings, please do reach out to us at managementplans@azwater.gov, or you can just sign in with your email address on those sign-in sheets outside the door there. We do add all of those email addresses to that mailing list. So are there any other questions, comments before we wrap up today? No? Great. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you for your time. We really do appreciate all the time that you contribute to this. We will see you all soon.